So, I'm a GP and I meditate, but I'm not fond of sitting cross-legged. I've never smoked pot or danced to the Grateful Dead, and eating lentils triggers my IBS. So why have I co-authored a book on mindfulness with Ed? Well, partly because, as anyone who knows me will tell you, I'm not the most laid-back person in the world. Like many people, I have a natural inclination towards overactivity, a trait that's not undesirable in a doctor, but that means I get stressed out. And I've had to recognize and continue to learn how important it is not to neglect my own mind and body in this process. But there's another reason, and that is that I recently realized I wasn't God. It may come as a surprise to some of you, but inherent in medical education is a subconscious expansion of the ego, culminating in the moment they put a scalpel in your hand and you cut into another human being. And of course, doctors are not solely responsible for the establishment of their divine status. Patients are also partly to blame for perpetuating the myth. And I guess it's hardly surprising. We all need someone to trust, someone who can help us conquer our physical impermanence, someone in whose hands we can place our lives. And as doctors, we're trained to take on this awesome responsibility. How? By never quite looking at the big picture, always focusing on the detail. We don't think about people, we think about patients. In fact, we don't very often even think about patients. We normally concentrate on their diagnosis. As a medical student, it was rare that I could remember the name of my patients. They were always simply identified by their physical signs, and the ward they were on usually, so the really interesting heart murmur on Marsden, or the guy with jaundice on Victoria, or even just the woman with the abdomen on Hopgood. How we ever managed to identify her from all the other women with abdomens, I've no idea. By the time I left medical school, I was under the impression that, rather like a mechanic might approach a car, my job was to identify the fault and mend it. And even if I couldn't diagnose the problem, no one left my consulting room without a prescription. I learned early the power of the placebo. It took me much longer to come to the realization that I'd only learned how to repair a few dents in the bodywork and change the oil on the human machine, but I still had no real idea how the engine worked. Around a third of all the patients we see as GPs have medically unexplained symptoms. When I still believed I was God, I called them hypochondriacs. Now I'm more likely to see it as a shared failing. Mine, because I don't have the answers they're seeking, and theirs for not recognizing their impermanence. And then, of course, there are all the patients for whom we understand the cause of their pain, but still cannot do anything about it. For all the amazing advances that there have been over the last 100 years, modern medicine is still limited, and it always will be, because we're always going to get ill, grow old, and eventually die. So I'm still left with my dilemma. How do I help the large portion of my patients who have very real symptoms, both psychological and physical, but for whom I have no cure? This was also the problem that faced a molecular biologist in the States called Jon Kabat-Zinn. He was a medic who practiced yoga and meditation, and he became convinced that meditation could help patients with chronic health problems, but who'd come to the end of the road with conventional medicine. Meditation wouldn't cure them, but might it help them cope better with their pain and their stress? Kabat-Zinn created a training program called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction, which taught meditation without any religious language or iconography. He then set about testing his course scientifically, proving that it could help with everything from pain to psoriasis. Above all, he showed that MBSR reduces people's stress, giving patients something they don't usually get from their doctors, a way of working with their minds. The results can be dramatic. People who've battled with health problems for years find relief through accepting and working with their condition in a new way, and by letting go of the desperate struggle to make things different from how they are. Mindfulness practice doesn't set out to try and cure our pain. It simply allows us to become familiar with our minds and our bodies, to stay with our experience rather than trying to distance ourselves from it, to become more inquisitive about our lives and the world we live in, and to develop an acceptance of how things are rather than always trying to change them. It enables patients to stop struggling with their physical symptoms and move on, not symptom-free, but with an acceptance of their limitations and a more compassionate relationship with their bodies and their minds. And this is not just about managing physical symptoms. In my practice, I see more and more people struggling to cope with the pressure they're under. The current economic climate's not helping. For many people, it's getting more and more difficult just to make ends meet. And the combination of financial pressures at home and cutbacks at work are taking their toll. When we don't perceive ourselves to have the resources to meet these demands, we feel stressed. Stress is one of those ubiquitous words that's used in a number of situations, but fundamentally it means that we feel overwhelmed. We cannot cope. We're being overstretched. As our stress levels increase, we become less flexible, more rigid and less resilient. Cracks begin to appear, and there's an inevitable impact on our health and well-being, which may not lead directly to my consulting room, but in the longer term is almost certainly going to. Perhaps the most immediate impact of our tired minds is on our mental health. The sense of not being able to cope with all the demands being placed on us feeds a vicious cycle of self-criticism that can so easily spiral into depression. And I know that Ed is going to talk a little bit more about his experience of this and the benefits of mindfulness in helping manage mental health problems in just a few minutes. However, we know that stress damages our physical health as well. We know that it's a factor in many chronic illnesses, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, irritable bowel, and chronic fatigue syndromes, to name a few. Stress puts strain on our hearts, raises our pulse and blood pressure, and suppresses our immune system. There's even some evidence to suggest that it has an effect at a chromosomal level, potentially accelerating the process of aging itself. So theoretically, if mindfulness meditation is an antidote to our stress, it will have physical benefits as well. Having not completely thrown off my empirical training, this idea appeals to me. Physiological changes can be studied and measured. It should therefore be possible to prove that mindfulness works. And whilst I'm not going to pretend the evidence is absolutely conclusive, it's certainly pretty convincing. Let me just give you a couple of examples. Psoriasis is a skin condition that we know is, in part at least, stress-related, and severe cases are treated using ultraviolet light. One study in the States found that the skin of patients who practiced mindfulness while receiving phototherapy cleared up to 4 times more quickly than those who had the light treatment alone. In helping to counter the stress response, mindfulness also helps to boost the immune system, the body's natural defense mechanism. This is because the hormone cortisol, released when we're stressed, acts to suppress the immune system. This could have potentially dramatic consequences, because our immune system is not just about fighting off the common cold. It also helps us recover from more serious illnesses. For example, one study following 38 women who participated in a mindfulness course after they'd had surgery for breast cancer showed them to have lower levels of cortisol and higher levels of natural killer cell activity than other women. These cells in the immune system can recognize and destroy any remaining cancer cells, potentially helping clear the cancer more effectively and preventing it from returning. Another piece of research looked at people with HIV. It was only a small study of 48 patients, but it showed that the levels of CD4 T cells, the cells in the immune system which HIV destroys, remained constant in patients participating in a mindfulness training course compared to a control group whose CD4 T cell count dropped over the same period. For the majority of us, however, it's the habitual coping patterns we fall back on when we're stressed that are just as damaging to our bodies. How many of us unwind with a glass of wine when we get home in the evening? And how often does the bottle ever make it back into the fridge? We eat fast food because we're too tired to cook. We stare hypnotically at the TV, too exhausted to move. We overdose on coffee to keep us going and sugar to calm us down. We have a cigarette to unwind after a row with the boss. We make plans to go to the gym, and then something more important comes along to distract us. And even in the moments when we're not rushing around frantically, perhaps a walk through the park on the way to work or on the bus home, our minds are still so caught up with what happened earlier or where we're going that we don't notice the opportunity to relax, even for a moment. Stress impacts on every aspect of our lives. It damages relationships and crushes creativity. We become disconnected from our minds, our bodies, and from the world around us, treating them with indifference rather than the compassion and care they deserve. What most of us don't have are the tools with which to work with our mind to keep it healthy. In the West, we've paid very little attention to our minds, focusing primarily on what is tangible, on what we can see, on our bodies. I'm increasingly of the view that by concentrating on our physical health in this way and ignoring our minds, we run the risk of missing the point completely. Because for so many of us, our unhealthy lifestyles are driven by our unhappy or anxious minds. We eat to cheer ourselves up. We drink to unwind. We smoke to calm down. Until we find a way to be happier, we have no chance of becoming healthier. It's a little bit like trying to drive a car and slow down by putting your foot on the brakes without taking your foot off the accelerator. I spent 7 years studying to become a doctor, and in that time I don't remember a single lecture, seminar or tutorial on how to maintain a healthy mind. We were taught to a molecular level on how to keep someone's heart healthy, but not one word on how to make it happy. So, although doctors probably recognize more than most the impact stress has on our patients, we too have relatively little to offer. In a recent survey by the Mental Health Foundation, 72% of GPs said they thought it would be helpful for patients with mental health problems to learn mindfulness meditation. And 69% even said that it would be useful for all their patients. A clear acknowledgement that there's a different way to work with our minds and our bodies. Unfortunately, 80% of GPs in the UK are like me and still have almost no access to mindfulness training for their patients on the NHS. So, is mindfulness the key to a healthier society? I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that practicing meditation is the only way to become more mindful, or that it's some sort of panacea for all our ills. I am, however, suggesting that we would all benefit from becoming more mindful, and that this is just one way of maintaining a healthy mind and defending against both mental and physical health problems, as well as allowing us to better manage them when they occur. I'm incredibly optimistic about mindfulness and the potential it has to help us all rebalance our lives. But most of all, as a GP, I'm delighted that there's an increasing body of evidence that's challenging the medical establishment to recognize what those of us who spend time with our patients have known all along, that people have minds as well as bodies, and we need to work with both.
Thanks very much, Jonty. Next up we have Tim Parks, who is an internationally renowned author, translator, and essayist. Having published 14 novels and 3 non-fiction accounts of life in Italy, Tim's latest work, Teach Us to Sit Still, Exhibit B, is a highly personal account of health, illness, and meditation, and has been hugely well received already. It's a real pleasure to have you here tonight, Tim, so without further ado, over to you.
I'm going to be relaxed. Oh, there we go. There we go. I've been asked to just give a personal account, so I don't have to give you any statistics. It's easier. I'll start by saying that up until about 5 years ago, I was so much in love with my stress levels and very busy mental activity that there was no way that you would have got me along to an evening on mindfulness or to read a book on mindfulness. And although one is so used to reading material that tells us that such and such a percent of a group achieves such and such a result, and this would appear to steer you in this direction, there was absolutely no chance of my falling out of love with my mental suffering. I think it's quite clear that in fact, almost all narrative that we read, particularly 20th century modernism and afterwards, indicates that to be interesting, you do indeed have to suffer mentally and physically. Or indeed, all Western narrative from Jesus Christ onwards indicates that. So the idea of solving one's problems was not foremost in my mind. Success was obviously much more important. Then I ran into a little problem which became a big problem. I'm not going to go into detail about the health problems that finally pushed me to be here this evening some years later. I'll just say that they were embarrassing, that they were intense, that words like bladder, prostate, sphincter came into them very frequently. There were long nights of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times to the bathroom. There were endless trips to the doctors, insertions of hard instruments in places where they ought not to be going. The doctors, as has been accurately described by our friend Jonty here, were eager to operate me, basically to put a sort of motorway through my prostate was the first suggestion. Interestingly suggested before any medical tests were done. And the fact that the medical tests indicated that I was in great shape in that department did not deter the doctors from wishing to operate me, which I thought showed a certain lack of faith on their part in the kind of technology that they were using. I shied away from that. I had initially gone, as has again been described, I had initially gone treating this illness as an irritant in the road to my great path to achievement. So that I hadn't really paid it any real attention. I began to feel that I and my body were like a married couple sort of separated at home, except of course that the body was home and that I was thus risking being the kind of husband who's pushed out. It really did reach a situation, however, where we were beyond any kind of joke. I couldn't sit down. It was too painful. I had to work standing up. I couldn't sleep after 4 or 5 in the morning because of the kind of pains I was getting. And what was interestingly beginning to happen was that I was obliged to look at it as part of the main curriculum of my life kind of thing, and start drawing in all kinds of other aspects of personal experience to start looking at it. Eventually, I began to discover the interesting things like looking at paintings for a long time seemed to lower pain levels. Something that I noticed and that seemed curious to me. I also began to notice a lot of dreams about water and about blockage or about excess or about that clearly would seem to be intersecting, and I'm the last person to be mystical. I think in the West we have a strong polarity between being either rational or being mystical, and having been brought up in a charismatic family where exorcisms were the order of the day throughout my adolescence, I tended to come down on the rational side with my brother. So that all this was very new to me, and in a certain sense very, very exciting, but also very frightening, because it was clear that when you get into that kind of pain for long kinds of periods, and also when you're clearly not unhealthy, in the sense that I did get out running all the time. I'd never ignored my body from that point of view. Actually, I frankly think that the getting to the gym can be just as bad as the glass of wine, because it's a kind of punishing the body back in just make sure that I can keep going. Let's get rapidly to the turning point. I have my 12 minutes. And it's kind of funny summing up 3 years of unhappiness and then improvement in this time. The turning point was on a purgatorial morning on the net I used to go down and trawl the net when I couldn't sleep to see if anybody had any new ideas about my problems. There are 6,800,000 hits for pelvic pain on the net, so you've got a lot of trawling to do if you really want to go there. And I eventually found this book with the rather bizarre title, A Headache in the Pelvis, a title which had me kind of, as a writer, thinking, what on earth was the publisher thinking about? Then I realized that the publisher was the writer, so can't blame the publisher for that one. And later I realized how intelligent this title was, much later. But anyway, this book very intelligently suggested that my problems were due to an atrophy of the muscle of the pelvic floor, due to living in a state of stress and tension and a lot of time on my butt in front of the computer and so on and so forth, but above all the stress and tension. And suggested anal massage in California, which was difficult from where I live in Verona, and also something called paradoxical relaxation. Now, this paradoxical relaxation it's so intelligent, this complicated name they thought for it, because it's the last thing, it seems miles away from mindlessness, this mindfulness. That was a good one. That's the funniest thing I will say this evening. Treasure it. It seemed miles away from anything wacky. It seemed very, very medical. The idea is that the paradoxical aspect is that you close your eyes while lying down. You go through some complicated breathing exercises. You concentrate on tension in your body, and you don't try to relax it. That's the paradoxical side. You don't try to relax it. So I decided to try to do this. Let me just read you just really 10 lines where they tell you how to do the breathing. Because if anybody ever gives you these kind of instructions, just skip them. The idea was to align the heartbeat with the breathing so that the pulse was a little faster on inhalation than exhalation. 6 deep abdominal breaths a minute was optimum, Dr. Wise suggested. I had never figured out what abdominal breaths were. There were now 9 numbered paragraphs of instructions. Take your pulse, paragraph 1 begins. I have never been able to take my pulse. Paragraph 4 reads, count up to 5 heartbeats. If your heart rate is 60, and as in the example above, as you inhale, raising your abdomen, and then count to 5 heartbeats as you exhale. If your heart rate is 72, you would count up to 6 beats as you inhale or exhale. There's no way I could do that, obviously. And it reminds one of I don't know, there's a character in Beckett's novel, Malloy, who counts his farts throughout the day and works out the frequency of farts, and then says, wonderful how mathematics helps you to know yourself. Yeah. In any event, I just settled for some deep breathing. I was convinced that I wasn't tense, and it took me a very long time to discover tension. When I discovered it, it exploded. Let me say at once that the whole thing was extremely difficult. One was supposed to just slowly eliminate language from the mind by concentrating on the body. It is extremely difficult to do this, especially for a chatterer and scribbler. But the thing that kept me going on this was that almost immediately I became fascinated by how interesting the body was when, with my eyes closed, I didn't go to sleep, but actually concentrated on it. And discovered, to my amazement, that all kinds of stuff was going on in there that I had never imagined. I think this is very much an initial experience with this kind of thing, because there is so much tension that at the beginning one is almost overwhelmed by the reactions. And it started working after about 10 days. I actually started getting reductions in pain. Now, very quickly, I look at my watch. Very quickly, let me say that after about 6 months, a shiatsu man I had decided to go to insisted that what I was doing was a form of meditation. I was outraged. It's not my department, but he insisted to me that that I should be open-minded, and that I was really basically afraid, and that I should be open-minded and try a Vipassana retreat. He was a great fan of Vipassana. So after about a year, kind of barriers had begun to come down, and I decided to go. In these retreats, one spends 3.5 days concentrating on one's breath for 10 hours a day in total silence. The whole retreat is in silence. And when you've learned to focus your mind on your breath and to stop thinking constantly, although of course words do continue to present themselves, one then explores the body with the kind of concentration that one's developed. This was the most extraordinary experience. It was unbelievably painful. One was not obliged to sit cross-legged, but everybody did, and so in a spirit of emulation and shame, I did too, and began to discover that there are very good reasons for sitting cross-legged. It was extremely painful. I don't know why I went on with it. It was emotionally extremely difficult to deal with because the thoughts were so constant and so obviously unpleasant and self-regarding that my self-esteem began to fall very rapidly. And indeed, I think what's interesting about a lot of talk about mindfulness is the lack of description of the resistance if one really tries to go for it. It is not easy. However, eventually things began to pay off. My body suddenly relaxed. It became comfortable to sit cross-legged, unbelievably. I'd legged been able to sit cross-legged. Even at school, I couldn't sit cross-legged. And then, all kinds of readjustments mentally. And above all, let me say this to conclude before I go too far or too long. It seems that hierarchically in the mind, if one decides to use this kind of technique as a kind of another instrument in the array of instruments, like one says, has got to the end of the road with conventional medicine. I never really got to the beginning with conventional medicine. It didn't do anything for me in this case, although conventional medicine is obviously wonderful in other cases. But if one tries to add it as an instrument, I don't believe that one is going to go very far. It's when hierarchically it ceases to be an instrument and becomes in itself simply a pleasure and engagement and a necessity that other things start to happen. Above all, a very deep reconnection with the body. And on this to close, I will say that reconnecting with the body in the sense of simply recognizing that you are your body, that self and body are two words but not two separate things. That when you do that, you reconnect to mortality. So the initial title, indeed, of my book was, the inspiration when I decided to write it, was a book called Towards Health, Towards Death. Because indeed, the key moment in this change that occurred to me was the moment when, very profoundly, one took on board mortality, and that kind of rearranged very sensibly, immediately, all the other stupid achievement-based obsessions that were dominating me. Towards health, towards death. Of course, no publisher was going to take that on board. And it is precisely that resistance to taking on board a title like that, which is the resistance to the experience of mindfulness, it seems to me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim. Next up we have Ed Halliwell, who's a mindfulness coach, co-author of the Mindful Manifesto, and author of the Mental Health Foundation's Be Mindful report from earlier this year. Ed is also well known for writing regularly for The Guardian on meditation, Buddhism, and well-being. So over to you, Ed. And just remind you that after he speaks for a while, you may be asked to do something. If you don't feel like doing it, just sit quietly, relax, and think about your breath, but let the others get on with it.
Thanks, Jonathan. And thank you, Jonty and Tim. In the last 2 years, the US National Institutes of Health has funded more than 100 grant proposals for mindfulness research. And in academic journals, new studies on mindfulness are currently being published at a rate of around 40 a month. Without all this research activity, we probably wouldn't be having this debate at the RSA tonight. We also wouldn't be in a situation where a meditation-based approach to working with depression has been endorsed by the National Institute for Clinical Excellence here in the UK and recommended for use on the NHS. We wouldn't be in a situation where courses that teach mindfulness are now being offered to people with conditions such as chronic pain, cancer, and anxiety, in workplace well-being programs, in addiction recovery centres, in schools, and in prisons. Because a strong evidence base for mindfulness is emerging, people who might have been put off by the prospect of meditation are learning the benefits of training the mind and relating to the world with greater awareness, steadiness, and compassion. Many people have now heard about mindfulness and its success in treating depression, achieving a 50% reduction in relapse rates among people who've had several previous episodes, or its ability to help with chronic pain, reducing both perception of pain and enhancing people's ability to cope with pain, or studies which show that mindfulness can sharpen attention skills or improve our capacity to communicate empathically with others. Or maybe they've heard about studies in neuroscience which suggest that practicing mindfulness can shift the brain towards states associated with greater emotional balance. And if you want to be convincing that something's good for your health these days, it's not good enough to say that it makes you feel better. You have to say that it changes your brain. All this information on the effects of mindfulness is really important because it helps people connect with a practice that they might previously have shied away from as being tainted with religion or New Age flakiness. Presented as a secular discipline, mindfulness is offered as a form of mental training, a way of paying attention, a down-to-earth practice that can help us enjoy healthier minds, just as physical exercise can help us keep our bodies in good shape. Organisations such as the Mental Health Foundation are now promoting mindfulness, campaigning to improve access to meditation training for people who need it, and even offering online learning resources for people who can't yet access a face-to-face course. And one of the contentions of our book is that if mindfulness is one of the keys to a healthier society, then it has to reach a large number of people. We're all affected by our environment, and we're much more likely to maintain a mindful approach to life, interested, measured, empathic, and aware, if those around us are supporting that approach and endeavouring to do the same. It's all too easy to be knocked off course when someone shouts at us for no good reason, or when we're bombarded by reams of mindless or even malicious gossip in the media. So if we want to create a mindful world, one that nurtures awareness and compassion, we need mindful institutions. Can you imagine a mindful parliamentary system where instead of a constant us and them ding-dong, Prime Minister's question time was preceded by 5 minutes of quiet meditation? An opportunity for politicians to remind themselves of how decisions tend to be driven by unconscious emotional impulses. Or mindful workplaces, where the drive for productivity and profit doesn't override concerns for employee well-being or corporate responsibility, which can, in the end, lead to both greater productivity and greater happiness. Our society uses scientific evidence as its gold standard. So in order to make the case that practicing mindfulness can help us become healthier and happier, we need this evidence. Nevertheless, I think there's a danger. Mindfulness isn't something that can be fully expressed by data or even by language. It's notoriously difficult to explain what mindfulness is in words, especially to someone who's never practiced meditation. We live in a world that values concepts highly, but mindfulness is a way of balancing our conceptual narrative framework with a more perceptual kind of awareness. Words, it's sometimes said in Buddhism, are like fingers pointing at the moon. But it's also said that we shouldn't mistake the fingers for the moon itself, which can only be seen directly by looking straight at it. And that's essentially what mindfulness is, a way of training our minds to look at experience directly, becoming ever more aware of the distorted judgments and preconceptions that we tend to lay on to our experience. I've spent the last 18 months writing about mindfulness, but I don't think I could have got much understanding without having developed a personal practice. And I first discovered meditation when I was depressed and anxious. I'd been living a fast-paced hedonistic lifestyle, and about a decade ago I collapsed under the weight of stress. And during the following 2.5 years, I desperately struggled for recovery. So I had a mountain of self-help and psychology books stacked up in my bedroom. I tried antidepressants, I had intensive psychotherapy, and I grasped after a whole range of alternative treatments. And among some of my pile of books were some books about meditation, and eventually I went along to a local centre that gave instruction. And there I learned something important. Although at first I approached meditation as just another quick fix, I actually found it was impossible to follow the instructions and to grasp for results simultaneously. So for the first time, a little bit of space was created in which I could simply watch my mind and see in it the speed, aggression, and self-criticism, some of which Tim was talking about, that was actually at the root of my problems. So it wasn't so much what I was doing that was making me so unhappy as how my mind worked. And it was going too hard, and it was going too fast. And I was desperately striving for things to get better, but it was that very striving that was making me feel worse. And in meditation, I started to realize that you can't solve the problems of a speedy, overcritical mind with a speedy, overcritical mind. Meditation practice hasn't changed my patterns of thought. And it also hasn't been a miracle cure for my moods. And like everyone else, I have good days and I have bad days. But it has changed, to some extent, the way I relate to my experience. In psychological terms, I'm more able to decenter from my experience. Or in Matthew Taylor's analogy, I'm more able to be the rider of the elephant of my mind, steering it through the jungle, rather than thinking that I am the elephant, getting spooked at every obstacle and ending up going on blind, destructive rampages. As I continued to practice, I realized that I was learning more than just a therapeutic technique. Meditation seemed to offer me a way to see things differently, to perceive them in a way that meant my appreciation of life was enhanced. I've become more able to appreciate the quality of experience, even when that quality isn't pleasant. I can be okay, even when I feel depressed. And it's very difficult to adequately describe this. It's something I believe that you have to try and to experience. As Jon Kabat-Zinn puts it, mindfulness is a way of seeing, a way of knowing, and a way of being. And it's a lot more than just a way to reduce the density of your amygdala. I do think it's fantastic that science is offering us a language to convince people that practicing mindfulness is worthwhile. But once they've started meditating, people might find that they're engaged in something that's far more interesting than just something to help them reduce their stress levels. While studies may show that mindfulness does indeed lead to less stress, depression, pain, and so on, what people are actually learning when they practice is to let go of the expectation of less stress, depression, and pain, and to notice, stay with, and to appreciate the texture of this very moment. So, can mindfulness lead to a healthier society? Probably. But if it happens, I don't think it will come from struggling for self-improvement and fighting our way into a better future. It's much more likely to come through groups of people working together to manifest qualities of mind that the RSA might call 21st century enlightenment, and that mindfulness practitioners might call wise mind. And that is the capacity for making decisions based on a fuller awareness of mind, body, and the world around us. So an awareness which seems to be cultivated through mindfulness practice. So I'm afraid that mindfulness isn't a quick fix, and you can't really experience it in just a few minutes. But before I finish, I would like to encourage you to take part in a very short practice. So just a 2-minute mindfulness exercise that might just give a bit of a taste of what's involved. And as Jonathan said, if you don't want to do it, that's fine. Just sit quietly. And if you'd like to join in, it's a practice that's often taught in mindfulness courses. It's called the 3-step breathing space. And it's something you can use any time of the day, whenever you are. And it's just a way of coming into awareness. So you can use it while you're waiting for a bus. You can use it when you're at your computer, waiting for a friend when you wake up in the morning. So you don't have to be sitting cross-legged to do it. So perhaps I could ask anyone to start just by taking a strong, confident sitting posture. And as best you can, just sitting upright with your spine straight and moving your back away, if you can, from the back of the seat so that your spine is self-supporting. Seeing if you can embody with your posture a sense of wakefulness and of being present. If you want to close your eyes, that's fine. If you want to keep them open, that's also fine. And so the first step is called acknowledging. So that means taking attention to whatever is happening in your experience at the moment. Asking yourself, what's going on? What's going on for me right now? And noticing sensations in the body. So there might be discomfort or tension, or it could be pleasant feelings, warmth, comfort, relaxation. And not judging those sensations, but just noticing them, just being with them. Now taking your attention to thoughts. Not analyzing your thoughts, but just watching them like you might watch clouds passing through the sky. Now bringing your attention to emotions. So taking your emotional temperature. Are you feeling joy at the moment? Sadness? Anger? Perhaps noticing whereabouts in the body that you're experiencing emotion. Perhaps there's no emotion at the moment. If that's the case, that's fine, just noticing that too. The second step is called gathering. So gathering your attention inwards, anchoring your experience on the movement of the breath. Taking your awareness to the breath as you experience it, perhaps in the abdomen. So just noticing the abdominal wall rising and falling. And just following the breath as best you can. Just anchoring the experience in the present moment, here and now. And now finally expanding. So allowing your awareness to expand so that it includes a sense of the whole body. So not trying to relax particularly, or judging experience as good or bad, but just noticing what's going on. Perhaps having a sense now that your whole body is breathing with the breath, so not just in the abdomen or in the chest, but in the whole body. Now, having a sense of the space around the body, perhaps taking in sounds or smells or points of contact or touch. Being aware of all your senses. What's going on in the room around. Just holding this experience in a soft and spacious awareness. Staying with that experience for just another few moments. And then whenever you're ready, opening your eyes, if they've been closed.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ed. Well, we're a little behind schedule, but you know what? I think I'm okay with that now. I'm going to ask a couple of questions and then pass it over to you. The first is, in some ways, Ed just referred to our RSA rider elephant and cultivated jungle metaphor. And in some ways, the elephant in this room, in some ways, is the word spirituality. And I want to ask Tim, first of all, but open it to the whole panel. Is mindfulness spiritual? What does that mean? And why does it matter?
Yeah, well, we're not going to resolve what the word spiritual means this evening, are we? It's a word about that presumably covers certain intimations people have which have become connected with religious experience. But I'm sure we're not quite sure what spiritual means. As I said, in my own case, I was extremely anxious not to get involved in anything religious. I do believe this was actually rather fearful of me, in the sense that, what did I have to be afraid of? They're not, it's kind of difficult to convert me. Like this guy said to me, Tim, you're 53, I was 50, I'm 55 now. What's going to happen? And I was very anxious when on arrival I discovered that lay Buddhism is frankly Buddhism, I mean, it's hard to put a credit card between them. So it was basically a Buddhist institution that I was engaged in, and there was, in the evening talks, because you can't talk but they can. In the evening there was a lot of talk about reincarnation and so on, which actually I found quite entertaining and interesting, not in a disparaging way at all. That said, let's arrive at what I think is the crux of this. I was amazed to discover day 7, day 8, day 9, that I was beginning to have intimations that I can only describe as spiritual. And above all, for a misanthrope like myself, and somebody who generally sees himself in a conspiracy of one against the world, I began to feel feelings of genuine, deep benevolence towards my fellow meditators, even when they couldn't sit still and kept making a noise, and when they coughed and sniffed and so on and so forth. And this is how I've now been to a number of these retreats, and it always happens, this sudden deep outpouring of, you find yourself saying absurd things like, we are fellow travelers, Jesus, this is me. So I do believe, I think that, the religious experiences are clearly all the gestures of religion are not there by accident. The position of kneeling, the position in the Muslim religion of this kneeling and the head on the ground. These are positions which actually change us emotively. And if you spend all that time breaking down your own sense of self and so on, you find these feelings emerging. That's all I can say.
Do you want to add anything to that?
I think it's up to you. And I'd echo Tim's point about what does spiritual mean, and very aware that you start using words like spirituality and religion, and you kind of send the temperature up into the stratosphere. So people have their own perceptions of what that means. For me, it was a really, really important part of my practice. I didn't discover mindfulness particularly in a secular context. I discovered it in a Buddhist context. And I was looking for that. I was looking for meaning. And I was looking for some sense of context and connection. Now that, to me, doesn't mean that I'm religious. I still don't think of myself as a religious person. But I think part of the reason why it helped me feel better was that I had a framework that made sense to me, and actually meditation was a way of investigating that framework and testing it in quite an empirical way, through using my own mind to look at things and to question them and to doubt them, and that for me was part of what meditation did, and the context was very, very important. I've heard mindfulness in its psychological kind of framework sometimes described as stealth Buddhism, and I think there's probably a little bit of truth in that. I also think that for me personally, there is something missing from practicing mindfulness in an entirely cognitive behavioral framework. It's great that I don't get so tied up in my ruminative mind, but that's not all that's going on for me in my own experience. But I also think it's totally fine for everybody to have their own investigation, and for some people that's not going to be the case. Some people may try it and they may discover, like Tim, that there's maybe something going on for them that's more than they expected. Other people may not.
I love that side of it. I mean, you know, that was wonderful. Oh, God, that was what's marvelous is to be able to approach those kind of new perceptions, new generosity without a metaphysical structure behind it. You know, it didn't immediately draw me into the whole. You know, I think there's a lot in Buddhism which, frankly, actually runs contrary to the experience of mindfulness. I think there are a lot of elements of reincarnation that make no sense at all in terms of that.
Just to draw back for a second, you yourself posited this polarity between the rational and the mystical in the sort of broadly Western context. And I wonder if that's not part of the problem, that actually there is that the mystical or the spiritual can be, you know, post-rational, beyond rationality, not just beneath it. And that what often happens is that people conflate the kind of mystical rainbow, let's all hold hands and sing Kumbaya, with a very serious spiritual practice, which is about really problematizing your own mind and trying to be grown up about it.
Well, it's clear that a lot of people who go to retreats are deeply disappointed because they go for mystical experience. You know, I mean, we all want to be rational, and at the same time, we want to have had a mystical experience. As you say, it's better if you just leave all the labels alone and just do it. One of the best things you said is just do it. I remember talking to a doctor who was doing this neurological research and talking about proofs and stuff, and I said, well, you know, have you done it? And he said, no. So, I mean, there they were, measuring everything. I said, well, you know, if you just did it, actually the proofs would begin to seem pretty small beer beside your experience of it. So, you know, it's really not terribly interesting to me to discover that it rewires my brain. I know it rewires. Sure. I know it, you know.
Just before I open it up, can I just have a quick straw poll of the room? Who has some experience of meditation, however minor? Okay, and we're looking at maybe about 2/3, that's my quick guess.
Well, everyone does now. They just had 2 minutes.
That's right, well, yeah. Well, I was trying to trick them, but yeah, you're way ahead of me. Okay, great. So can we have some questions from the audience?